Now we got to move fast in world history. So earlier this week, we just gave Napoleon his empire, but now we're going to take it away because we got stuff to get to. All right. And Napoleon's empire is going to fall apart, and it's pretty easy to trace what happens. So it's not a complicated story. And it starts where we left off last time, and that is with Napoleon not being able to deal with Britain, right? Britain's here off the coast, and after he loses the Battle of Trafalgar, he doesn't have enough naval power to physically invade the United Kingdom. So they're safe sitting there offshore. And so what Napoleon's going to try to do is make economic warfare against them with something he's going to call the continental system. And he's going to establish a blockade. He's going to build this giant red floating wall out in the ocean that no British ships can get through. Okay, he doesn't really do that. He uses his navy to seal off the ports, and he doesn't want Britain to be able to trade at any port in Europe, and he's hoping to hurt their economy that way. And he's hoping to achieve more than that, actually. He wants to organize all the stuff, all his allies and all the territories he's taken over in Europe. He wants to organize them into one big economy, like they're doing now with the European Union. And it might have worked, and initially it was pretty popular, but he ran the whole economy of the continent to benefit France and himself. So pretty soon the other countries are less than happy at being locked into the continental system. And from Britain's perspective, they don't really mind because there's this huge back door into the continent, which is Portugal. Okay, Napoleon does not control Portugal, and so the UK and anybody else that wants to can smuggle goods in through the port at Lisbon or many other Portugal ports. That's fun to say, and basically buy and sell all the goods they want. So Napoleon's first thing he's going to have to do is try to conquer Portugal and stop all the smuggling going in and out. Right. Britain is able to keep France from trading beyond the continent, and this is going to happen again in World War I. So Britain locks France down to the continent, Napoleon locks Britain out of Europe, and we're going to get a long standoff. All right, but Napoleon's going to seek to hold the system together, and that's what's going to actually make everything fall apart. War of 1812, you'll learn about that next year, but just keep in mind the War of 1812 is a byproduct of the war between the British and Napoleon. This war first starts in what's called the Peninsula, right? The Peninsular War. And that peninsula is the Iberian Peninsula, so most of it is Spain, but over here is Portugal I was talking about. And Napoleon, he had an alliance with Spain, and he sends his armies through Spain on the way to Portugal, but his armies are so impolite and abusive of the population that the Spanish rise up in revolt against French domination. And so Napoleon, in reaction to that, deposes, gets rid of the Spanish king and puts another one of his brothers in charge. And so he makes his brother king of Spain, and this makes the revolt worse. And so now Napoleon is dealing not only with trying to get through Spain to fight the Portuguese, but also he's got a revolt all around him in territory he thought he controlled. And here he faces a very modern kind of war. The Spanish, they could never go assembled on a field of battle and square off against the French armies. They would be destroyed. So they don't do that. They make small attacks, and they hide in little groups, and they pick their spots, and they attack and then disappear again. And it's a little war that they're waging, or a guerrilla. And what we call that in English is guerrilla warfare, or the more modern term is insurgent warfare. That's what our army faces all the time because it's so massive that people don't want to fight against it in traditional pitched battles. And so they blow up bridges, they set roadside bombs, they snipe at troops, they do all of this kind of stuff that's very hard to stop. And that's what the Spanish are doing against Napoleon, and it's a constant drain on his army. And it's really good news for the British. The British give the Spanish guerrillas weapons, money, all this stuff to help them wear down Napoleon and his army. And ultimately, the British will get directly involved in combat against Napoleon in Spain and Portugal. And he loses 300,000 soldiers. Now, not all killed, basically 300,000 killed or wounded to the point where they are no longer good for military service. But still, he loses 300,000 men over the years that he's trapped in Spain in this nasty little guerrilla war. And that inspires people in other parts of Europe to rise up against the French. And essentially, he's going to face little revolts everywhere. And that's going to really stretch his resources. So this is the beginning of things falling apart. What really makes things fall apart is when he tries to enforce the continental system with the Russians. Now, the Russians had a big trade with Britain, especially in timber. The British, they'd chopped down and burned every tree in Britain centuries before this, because it's a small place and an ancient place. And Russians have huge forests. And the Russian boyars, remember them? The Russian nobles, remember Peter the Great, cut their beards? Well, they like selling timber to the British in exchange for money and British goods, and they don't want to stop. And initially, Nicholas III was a huge Napoleon fanboy and had pulled Russia out of the war and allied with Napoleon, but then he's replaced by Alexander I, who's not as big a fan of Napoleon. And Alexander I openly breaks with Napoleon and lets his nobles begin to carry out open trade. And Napoleon, he can't accept that. If he lets one nation break the rules, they're all going to do it. So he has to invade Russia, he feels. And because you don't want to be in Russia in the winter, he starts his invasion right at the beginning of summer, which seems to make sense. So in June of 1812, his army marches into Russia with, and here's the number, 420,000 men. It goes up as high in the video. Estimates are over 650,000. So it depends how you count, and you French forces versus Allied forces, but it's a lot of guys. And they push eastward into Russia. And the Russians, those of you who plan to invade Russia, I would say don't, first of all. But then keep in mind, the Russians will never run out of land, and they'll never run out of people. Okay, Russia covers 13 time zones. The continental US covers 3. All right, that's how big Russia is. And they have almost a limitless supply of people. And so the Russians, whenever someone invades, they just keep backing up. And they back up, and you, as you think you're conquering land inside Russia, you're getting further and further away from home. You're getting further and further away from your supplies and closer to the freezing cold winter. And when that hits, then the Russians counterattack, and you're stuck in the middle of Russia, and you have a hard time getting back out. The high point of French conquest was the Battle of Borodino, which the Russians lose and retreat tactically, and that leaves Napoleon open road to Moscow, the former and current Russian capital. And the Russians give up Moscow willingly, but they set the whole city on fire before leaving it. So Napoleon captures a burning ruin of Moscow, and then the snow starts to fall. And Napoleon, without supplies and a sick army, begins to retreat. And he loses, as you'll see in the video, a huge amount. The vast majority of his troops never make it out of Russia. And they're either killed in combat, they die of disease. A lot of them, believe it or not, are killed and eaten by wolves. I mean, it's just, you don't want to be on this forced march out of Russia. And when Napoleon finally gets out of Russia, his army's so weak that the other nations are going to counterattack. We'll talk about that in a minute. Let's quickly look at Napoleon in Russia. And this will cover the continental system.
This video is sponsored by Brilliant.
And it's sponsored by Brilliant.
Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian, and today we're going to be examining how Napoleon failed in his invasion of Russia. It is often said that Napoleon's invasion of Russia was unsuccessful merely because of the harshness of the Russian winter. However, it doesn't take an experienced historian to point out why this statement is highly reductive. As with any historical event, there's never just one answer. And so the question remains, how did Napoleon's army, the largest and most experienced of all contemporary armies, lose to a smaller and less experienced force? The story begins when Napoleon seized control of France in 1799. His ultimate ambition was nothing less than to conquer Europe, and as can be expected, this sparked a string of conflicts, creatively named the Napoleonic Wars, in which successive coalitions, all of which were spearheaded by Great Britain, were formed in order to defeat the revolution. France was victorious against almost all of these coalitions, but victory still came at a very high price. As Britain essentially led all of these coalitions, Napoleon decided that in order to prevent any more from forming against him, he had to destroy the British war effort. In 1806, Napoleon implemented a series of trade decrees known as the Continental System, the ultimate goal of which was to ruin the British economy by restricting their trade with the rest of Europe, especially with Russia, one of Britain's largest trading partners. Initially, Napoleon only raised tariffs to discourage commerce, but eventually all forms of trade were banned with England. He expected every nation to comply under the threat of military retaliation. His expectations would fall flat, however, as smuggling, non-enforcement, and even flat-out refusal were commonplace. In the words of Adam Zamoyski, author of 1812, Napoleon's Fatal March on Moscow, calls for peace with France might well have been fulfilled if British trade had really begun to suffer. But in the long run, France probably suffered more than Britain, and Napoleon's continental system, as he called it, was in effect unenforceable. As can be expected, Russia was openly disregarding the continental system by 1810, creating friction between itself and France. This only served to make Napoleon anxious about his eastern holdings. And in 1811, 1 year before the invasion of Russia was initiated, he had already begun assembling his Grande Armée, a massive force that was composed of over 685,000 men, and more than 1,300 pieces of artillery. In contrast, the Russian army consisted of around 500,000 men, 80,000 of whom were Cossacks, and approximately the same amount of guns as the French. Therefore, considering the quantity of troops each side had, it seems as though the French held the advantage, but as we'll see, this was not the case. In order to explore how the Grande Armée was almost annihilated, it is necessary to understand how Napoleon's armies had been sustained in his earlier campaigns, how he conducted the invasion, and how the Russians adapted to it. In regards to the first point, throughout his previous conquests, Napoleon's soldiers were expected to live off the lands they marched through. For the average French soldier, this meant foraging the wilderness and taking crops and livestock from local farmers. This strategy, combined with logistic trains, was sufficient in the beginning of the Russian campaign, which began on the 24th of June, 1812, when Napoleon crossed the river Niemen, entering Russian territory. After failing to destroy the Grande Armée in several small battles, the Russians, who knew how important foraging was to Napoleon's soldiers, decided to retreat eastward in order to draw Napoleon deeper and deeper into hostile territory and overextend his lines of supply and communication. This constant retreat continued throughout the remainder of the summer. Before they would let Napoleon take Moscow, however, the Russians decided to engage his army in a large pitched battle in order to weaken and deplete it. On the 7th of September, the Russians and the French clashed outside of Moscow, near the suburb of Borodino. This battle, which resulted in between 68,000 and 90,000 casualties, proved to be the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars, and although the French claimed victory, they were exhausted. When they finally entered into Moscow, they were dismayed to find the city had been evacuated and set alight by the retreating Russians. More than anything, the burning of Moscow demonstrated to Napoleon that the Russians were so patriotic that they were unwilling to surrender. It also exemplified the scorched earth policy that the Russians adopted, in which crops, livestock, munitions, and other resources were destroyed in order to prevent their use by the invaders. Napoleon, who was becoming increasingly wary of the lack of supplies which the scorched earth policy entailed, wrote a letter to Alexander I, leader of Russia, imploring him to capitulate. However, by the end of September, Napoleon had to come to terms with the fact that the Russians would not surrender, and with nothing to sustain itself, the Grande Armée began to starve. Napoleon left Moscow on the 19th of October. On the torturous march back home, the Grande Armée's remaining ranks were devastated by typhoid fever, starvation, and the bitter cold of the Russian winter. The organization of Napoleon's forces began to crumble, with any stragglers being picked off by Russian cavalry. When the French finally crossed back into Poland on the 14th of December, only 10,000 men of the original 685,000 strong Grande Armée were still fit for combat. Napoleon was so severely weakened by the failure of his campaign that the nations of Europe, including those of which were previously controlled by him, formed a sixth coalition in March of 1813. Within a year, the French army, which had never fully recovered from the invasion of Russia, was defeated and expelled from the territories it occupied, and Napoleon himself was exiled to the island of Elba. However, the Napoleonic Wars were not yet over.
All right. So the invasion of Russia really is what seals his fate, but there are still some events left to unfold. So as the video said, when he returns with his weakened army, that's when the other powers of Europe pounce, and we get Napoleon's downfall. The first major battle between the Sixth Coalition and Napoleon is the biggest battle of the war. And it's called the Battle of Nations because if you look how many different countries are involved in this, all against Napoleon. All right, so he loses the Battle of Nations and is defeated, and then he is apprehended and exiled to the island of Elba. And that brings us to the warm-up. So if you look at this over here, this is Elba. Look how close it is to Italy, right? It's nice. Okay, it's in the Tyrrhenian Sea. And he has a mansion and he has servants, but it's just him essentially being held prisoner there. And you guys said you could be there days, weeks, or months. He stays for 9 months and 21 days before he breaks out and tries to get back to Europe, which he does do. And he actually is able to almost retake power. And he's active in Europe, commanding armies, fighting again for 100 days before he loses again. And so he returns. Many of his troops are still loyal to him and not the new king, Louis XVIII in France. And Napoleon takes to the field, once again. But by now, his tactics, his military fighting style is the old-fashioned one. And he loses to the British under Wellington, the guy who had fought him in Spain, and General Blucher of Prussia, and Napoleon's defeated at Waterloo. And that's his last defeat. And then he is once again apprehended. That ends the 100 days. And he's exiled now, not to nice, cheery Elba, but to St. Helena, which is in the freaking middle of the Atlantic Ocean, 1,000 miles from anywhere. So he will never escape. And he will die there in 1821 after writing his memoirs, etc. And that will exit Napoleon from the world stage. But his impact will be felt for another century, and in large part because of the meeting that they have after Napoleon is gone to put Europe back together. And that's what we're going to look at next week, and that's the Congress of Vienna.